This is just something that came about with an author that I know who lives in Paris. Her name is Lauren Elkin, and she actually has a novel coming out in French. It hasn't been published in English, even though she wrote it in English, but it was translated to French and is being published over there. And we wanted to write a book together, so we were just kind of thinking about things that interested us. And this was definitely something that we both found that we could write a lot about. And I think it's kind of an interesting question. You mentioned earlier, or maybe it was you, Daniel, that the Oulipo has been around for 50 years, which is really a lot longer than a lot of movements last, and it certainly had a huge impact. And kind of a question that comes up in this book that Daniel wrote is, what's it up to now, and kind of the whole historical legacy, like how much is that baggage and how much is that kind of constraining, no pun intended, to kind of constraining what they're doing right now. So it's kind of an interesting question. Does the Oulipo kind of have more innovation in it? What kind of things are being written by the Oulipo right now? And also, I think, what kind of authors have really taken a lot of lessons from them that are informally of the movement? We definitely talk about a lot of people that are doing interesting stuff who actually aren't Oulipo authors, and that may kind of give them a little room to maneuver, whereas if you're actually in the group, you don't quite have as much freedom to do the kind of things you might be doing.
Maybe the analogy is not so apt, but I think of the Constitution, this baseline document that you can amend constantly. So isn't there maybe some flexibility there where it's a very flexible collective that I don't see it so straining at first glance.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of look at it like open source technology. Like they made all these cool kind of bits of code or all these interesting ideas, and really anybody can take them up. And so, I mean, definitely a lot of the stuff that's going on inside the movement is interesting, but it seems like, maybe people who haven't even been discovered by the Oulipo yet are just kind of picking up these ideas and taking them in all these directions. There's an interesting Christian poet, or an interesting Canadian poet named Christian Bach, which I'm actually kind of curious why he hasn't been co-opted. Maybe you could speak to that a little bit later. But he's just done some crazy stuff. Like, he made, over the course of 9 years, he made a piece of DNA that was a poem. Somehow we got the DNA to be a poem itself, and he fed it into an E. coli bacterium, and then the E. coli emitted a poem in response to being injected. That stuff to me is just crazy. I mean, it's very conceptual. I mean, you can kind of argue if that's even literature, but that kind of stuff just seems to have a lot of energy.
I'm sitting over here being like, that's not weird at all.
I'm curious, what's the weird stuff?
I'll tell you when you're older.
Maybe, Robin, you can speak to this, but there's the whole realm now of computers and the internet and what you're able to do with machines that you couldn't do 50 years ago. What interests you there?
Yeah, so, I was actually, we were chatting about this earlier, and I was asking this question about the way that computers had sort of intersected with the Oulipo or not, because reading this, in some ways I think I'm in some ways a representative of the audience on this panel, because I'm not a poet and not an Oulipo scholar, and this was actually all new to me when I read the book, but reading it, especially being situated sort of here in San Francisco and sort of situated in the technology world, because I worked at Twitter here in San Francisco for 2 years, which of course is this great public constraint. Never have more people been operating under a very simple, almost poetic constraint, 140 characters at the tweet, ever before in history. Sometimes to really sort of wonderful effect. And reading it through that lens, I was like, they should assign this at Facebook or Zynga or these other companies where, and the reason, and it might actually be clear why I thought that if you think of it as a book about a kind of crazy secret society of poets based in France, because I think that's actually not what it's about. That's kind of where we come into it. But I think probably my favorite line in the whole book comes early. In some ways, I think it's kind of the thesis. Where Daniel writes, the most important point in this book is that it makes no difference whether you're an official rat or just a slightly intrigued onlooker. The potential of literature, the potential of language to be literature is squarely in the public domain and every bit as much yours as it is mine. And it sounds like open source. It sounds like a set of tools to help more people be creative or produce creative work, not fewer. And actually, maybe weirdly, that's an exercise that a lot of very smart people are engaged in right here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, figuring out frames and figuring out interesting constraints, whether it's the 140 characters of Twitter or the perfect square of an Instagram photo, or there's a lot more of these things that people are trying to come up with that will help people make stuff. So that's what I was kind of thinking of, and it actually ended up being a lot less esoteric than I expected, and especially being here, especially being in the Bay Area, I thought, yeah, this is like actually kind of what we're doing here now, where a lot of people here are doing that.
And Matthew, you're deep in the book. It's a good read. You come at it from the perspective of a poet.
Yeah.
Tell us about your
Well,
your love of Oulipo.
I had a similar experience to Daniel, actually, where I sort of stumbled upon Oulipo after I'd been writing for a while, and recognized in them the impulse that I had had myself to impose arbitrary and I think one term that hasn't come up yet but maybe is implicit, is humorous constraints upon myself to see what would happen to my imagination. So when I came across Oulipo, I thought, oh, this is just a much more developed example of something that I've been doing since I first started writing, which was to come up with absurd, arbitrary restrictions upon myself to produce the creative act and get over the horrible snowstorm of facing the blank page, and to begin writing. And so, my own personal, we were talking about this before we came over here. I mean, my own personal interest is in using these kinds of techniques as generative devices, and then moving forward in maybe, let's say, a more idiosyncratic or like traditionally inspirational way. But I'm intrigued and fascinated and very happy about the fact that there are people who push past whatever impulse there is to merely use these techniques as generative ones and to actually follow them through to see what happens. I think very beautiful, strange, amazing pieces of writing come out of these Oulipian behaviors that wouldn't happen if the people didn't monomaniacally adhere to the original constraint. So it's not my personal that's not the kind of person I am. I'm too fucking easily distracted. But I love the fact that there are people who are not. And so I love the Oulipians. I think they're hilarious and awesome and just great and smart. And so yeah, I really like reading the book a lot. And I think just the last thing I'll say is like that. The idea of being an inspired or an artistic person is something that is so ingrained in our consciousness. It comes from, it's hundreds of years old. I mean, if you read the second preface to Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth in 1799, he basically describes what it means to be an inspired and artistic person. And that idea is so ingrained in our concept of what an artist is. And I think it's super productive to have people who come at it from a completely different way and strangify that idea so that we don't take for granted these hackneyed and repetitive ideas of artistic inspiration. And I like the Oulipians for that also. In that sense, they belong with the surrealists and other people who have tried to democratize literary inspiration. So I'm a big fan, and I really like this book a lot. I recommend everybody read it. It's also just an appealing book to read.